As folks are starting to stream in, I'm going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot of content to cover today. And we really want to make sure that if this is the first time that you've joined this webinar, it really is supposed to be a discussion and a conversation. And so we try to create a really engaging and insightful chat box. So if you have comments or ideas or something pops into your head, you're not alone in that idea. And so please make sure to share it and capture it in the chat box. And then everything that we get in the chat box, we try to distill into a summary piece. And will everybody just mute as they come in, getting some feedback? Somebody muted me. But we try and distill all those ideas and share them back with you on our website. So if you check out, if somebody can put into the chat box, the local regional food system website for the project, and we record these webinars and post them there, as well as provide a written summary. So if you don't have the time to watch the full webinar, that you can peruse that written summary. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Today, we'll be talking about tracking consumer and market trends. And unlike some of our previous panels, we're going to hear from a number of different speakers, and then we're going to invite some panelists to reflect on what we're sharing and on a couple of different topics. So we've got some folks that I'll let them introduce themselves as we move forward. So just to tell you a little bit more about this project, it really started as a response of recognizing the need to rapidly capture and share the lessons that were being learned during COVID. And I don't think any of us had any idea that it was going to last as long as it did. And so right now we are kind of in this reflection period to say, what ideas, approaches, innovations can we take from that experience and apply it moving forward, recognizing especially the fact that disruptions are going to continue to happen, be they war or closure of shipping channels or a shortage of oil or climate change. And so this really nationwide experience is helping us to coalesce together as a network and think about how best to share these ideas and innovations. So it's a collaborative effort. It was a cooperative agreement with the USDA AMS. We've got 2 university partners, and we're going to have researchers from both of those universities speak with us today, from Colorado State University as well as the University of Kentucky. And then in addition to those kind of university and government partners, we also have this amazing community of practice of different stakeholder groups that represent networks across the country. And so we've got two organizations represented, 3 panelists from those organizations that will join us today and provide their reflection and how it relates to their particular sectors. And the way that we've kind of organized it, because this is kind of a really massive concept and idea and issue, is that we've broken it into 3 buckets. I don't know if anybody spent time with academics, but they love the number 3, and they always try to break everything into 3s. So we've got data and metrics, and they're working on a data warehouse to try and bring together resources and information from multiple different sites and sectors around the federal government, state governments, county governments, as well as our different stakeholder groups. And then they're working with the Census Bureau to create a tool to help visualize and think through some of those resources and make it more accessible and useful for the folks on the ground. We've also got a network of networks. One of the key lessons that was learned during that first year kind of in the pandemic was the importance of having relationships and trust built between organizations to allow lessons to be learned across sectors. So taking an idea that's being implemented in farmers markets and applying it to restaurants, or hearing from commercial kitchens, the similarities in farmers markets and the natural overlap that exists in that space and opportunities for building stronger relationships there. So we're working with that group and we'll be sharing about that at next month's webinar. And then finally, we've got the resiliency playbook. And this is really trying to review and synthesize a lot of the tools and resources that were created out of the last year's project and make it more accessible and think through how could you apply these specific lessons to other types of disasters, be it wildfire, storms, or other continuing on issues. So what are we doing today? We're going to talk about consumer behavior. So one of the things that, and Dawn will talk about this more in detail, but one of the things that came out of last year's gatherings of these different sectors was, hey, why do each of us need to go out and survey consumers? Why don't we work together and we'll have one nationwide survey that looks at multiple different market channels, and then we can all use that as a tool to help inform our sector moving forward. So we're going to explore a lot of what are these consumer behaviors around purchasing of food, and how is that impacting food markets? And then finally, with the amazing knowledge and expertise of our panelists, we're also going to take this and think about what are the implications for policy. So taking it one step further. So as I said, I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves because they will do a much better job than I will. So first, let's hear from Ashley Colpart with the Food Corridor.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's been wonderful working with this group and seeing all the innovations that happen across all the different sectors. My name is Ashley Colpart. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called the Food Corridor. I'm also a graduate, PhD graduate of Colorado State University, which is how I'm connected to this project. My dissertation research was looking at underutilized assets in the food space and how to leverage those assets to support local food economies. So specifically, I started looking at shared use kitchen, which was a sharing economy type look at commercial kitchen space. And so where do these kitchens exist? Oftentimes they end up being the center of a local food economy because it's where small food entrepreneurs go to start and leverage and scale businesses. And then my company essentially creates software for the industry. So we help those shared kitchen operators manage their internal operations. So the scheduling and booking of a multi-tenant situation, compliance management of the business license, insurance, and food handler card for the renters, as well as billing. And one innovation that was mentioned in the introduction by Libby that we've been looking at and largely due to this project and being able to kind of see across different sectors is that farmers market managers oftentimes are handling and managing vendors the same way that shared use kitchen operators and managers are. So we're starting to see a lot of synergies between those two groups. We also have a couple shared use kitchen operators that have farmers markets in their facilities, and they're starting to kind of use our software to manage vendors in across ways. So the technology was never designed to manage that type of situation, but because of the relationships we're building across these sectors, we're seeing opportunities that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. So that's something kind of exciting that's happening for us right now at the Food Corridor. So I'm really excited to be on this panel and talking about consumer behaviors around COVID, because we were able to really see that from the perspective of the entrepreneur and the vendors and the types of businesses that were popping up in communities all over the country at that very micro level. So excited to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Ashley. Let's hear from Nichelle Harriet with the National Sustainable Agricultural Coalition.
Hi, good afternoon. If you're on the East Coast, good morning. If you're on the West, thank you for having us. This is my first time speaking with this group, so I'm happy to be here. My name is Nichelle Harriet. I am a senior policy specialist with the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, or NSAC for short, here in Washington, D.C. We are a 30-plus-year-old organization with about 130 or so coalition members from across the country. And our coalition members are farmer-led organizations who, while they are in the field working with farmers, we are on the Hill advocating on their behalf. So that's pretty much what NSAC does. But my particular portfolio includes advocacy for ag research in general, especially increasing funding and other resources for competitive grant programs and other research programs across USDA's entire remission area. So as you can imagine, we have a lot of work to do, because I'm sure a lot of you would love to see more funding coming your way for research, education, and extension. I am also particularly interested in helping researchers like yourself explore different ways to advocate at the policy level to ensure that your research that you're doing right now can have an impact on public policy. And that is particularly important as we start talking about the next Farm Bill, the 2023 Farm Bill. We want to make sure that we have the most up-to-date data to influence how we support these programs that best assist farmers and consumers out there. So with that, I guess I'll hand it over to my colleague, Wes.
Yeah, thanks, Nichelle, and thanks for talking a little bit about INSAC, saving me from having to do that. So I'll just talk a little bit more about myself. So Wes King, Senior Policy Advisor with INSAC. Here at INSAC, I lead our budget and appropriations work, as well as our local and regional food systems policy advocacy work. So I'm leading for the coalition across the board, our work to try to increase funding for a whole host of various programs, but things like the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program or the Local Agriculture Market Program. In addition to that budget and appropriations work, I lead our what is more or less Farm Bill, but also some administrative USDA focused or focused policy advocacy work. So I've been working here this spring, in addition to appropriation stuff, starting to work with some of the key champions in Congress when it comes to local and regional food systems on putting together legislation to expand upon some of the great wins that were included in the last Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill, so that we've got more resources and more policies available to help grow and expand local and regional food systems via the next Farm Bill, the 2023 Farm Bill.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here. I think I'm really excited about this discussion and what we can hear and hear your reflections on the research that these folks will be sharing. So as I mentioned, this is a collaborative project with the Colorado State University as well as the University of Kentucky. And so we have 4 amazing researchers that will be sharing a little bit of the work that they're doing. And I really want to stress that this is just the highlight reel. We didn't want to overwhelm you or bore you with too many PowerPoint slides. So each of them were charged with just coming with 2 or 4 slides from the information, from the data. But there will be a deeper dive into each of these kind of topics or subject matters as part of our consumer food insight. These are going to be available on our website. The first of them should be published by the start of next week. But if you want to take a look at the past survey and the results that were from that survey, they are already up on our website, and you can get a sense of kind of what the research and how they'll be reported in the future. So some of the key themes that we're going to be exploring today really are how are short-term shocks that we all experienced evolving into kind of long-term changes in consumer behavior, and which ones of these we can expect to continue on moving into the future. And we're going to explore this along a couple of different dimensions. We're going to explore changes in behavior along the dimension of community size, so looking at rural communities, kind of intermediate, suburban, smaller metro areas, and then large metro areas. We'll also look at some household characteristics, as well as the continued turn towards online purchases. And then finally, we'll do a deeper dive into food security and how the economic challenges faced by households are continuing on for families, and what that looks like in terms of their food acquisition. And then kind of the dimensions for the panelists we'll be exploring are how are these local and regional food systems sectors responding to these changes in demand, and what are the long-term policy implications. So at this point, so as I said that there were 2 surveys, so this is the second of the survey. The first survey was conducted in October and November of 2020. And it tried to look at consumer behavior before COVID happened, so in that September time. And then the idea is that there was a recall process for survey participants. And so we asked them to think about when the pandemic began in April. And then kind of as things started getting a little bit more quote unquote normal in September 2020. So this one we just completed was conducted during November through January. And it looked at October 2020, and we really wanted to make sure that there was overlap between the last of that first survey and the first part of this survey, and then October 2021. And so I don't know about you, but my brain is kind of foggy when I think about where we are in the pandemic or where we were or what was happening in my life at any of those given times. So I went ahead and just charted the number of new cases of COVID and then where we kind of asked people to do the recall. So what was happening in September of that should be, there's a wrong date, I apologize. So the recall would be in September. And ask folks before COVID, and then April 2020, that was right when cases started going up, and we started, there was full lockdown. September 2020 was going into this winter season where we saw a big spike in cases, and you can see the importance of kind of the overlap between September 2020 and October 2020 because it was a very similar situation. And then at the end we have September or October 2021. And that was, again, where we saw another spike in those cases. So who did we survey? We have a national representative sample, but because, as we all are aware, we're an increasingly urban country. And so there's just larger concentrations of respondents in those urban centers and cores. So there's a lot more on the coast. It's also, we had 5,000 people from across the country. So it limits our ability to disaggregate the data. So we're not able to look at any individual states' responses. So in the previous survey, folks requested that we explored kind of like what's happening in my state. It's so important what's happening in my state. But because of the size of the sample, that's not possible. So what we did do is we'll hear from Jairus talking about the different sizes of communities to try and see if there's some consistency about what's happening in kind of those smaller communities, medium-sized communities, and larger communities. And now I'm going to hand it off to Dawn to really start talking about some of the demographics.
Great, thanks, Libby. I think you set the discussion up well. And we, again, want to err on the side of using your time well. So we're going through these things quickly, but if you have questions, just put them in the chat box for any details we may not have covered that are of interest to you, and we'll make sure to cover those. Just so you understand that we did our best to make sure this was a representative sample. You can see here some of the statistics we collected. You know, we have a household size somewhere between 2 and 3, which is what is our national average now. And about a little over a third of those have some children still at home. We have a fairly representative set of income groups, which was really important to us, because as you'll see later, we're talking about food security issues as well. The one place we had to do a little bit of combination is once we were above $100,000 annual income, we are a little short on the ones between 100 and 150 and high on those above 150. So, but once you combine them, we have the right share. And we all kind of agreed that that's kind of a threshold where the amount you're spending on food kind of levels off to about the same proportion. So we felt that was an okay issue to have. And we also looked again at the ethnicity of the sample that we have. And again, we're very close to census statistics on the share of our population that's white and some major other ethnicities that people identify with. But again, like we're continuing to see done with census statistics, we broke down that white population and allowed those who are Hispanic to actually self-identify both whether they identified as Hispanic and then what enclave of Hispanic population they have affiliated with. And again, very similar both to last year's sample and to what we would expect from what the census statistics tell us. And of course, this is something the census is going to have to take on, but what we're seeing, which everyone is seeing, is that multi-race is really becoming the new norm, and it's far more of a continuum than people having categories anymore. But again, we're representative of what we expect to see in the United States. Next slide. So another thing this is not necessarily a demographic, but another thing we wanted to know about households, and you'll see in a few of our questions later on, we'll use this information as a way to kind of almost partition our sample to talk about how different households might have been handling things, because we knew the two major shocks that happened to households because of the pandemic were what it did to their economics and what it did to their perceived risk of there being significant health conditions that would affect their household. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that still 1 year later, if you'll remember, we had a significant number of households, and it's in the Consumer Food Insights that were affected last year. It has leveled off a little bit, but we still see it's mostly, if there has been a change, and that's less than half of the population, most of the change has been in a negative direction with a loss of jobs, reduced hours, or furloughed. Although we do have a set of our population who actually, this ended up actually increasing their need to work, and that's probably in the essential services. And we did ask that in another part of the survey, but have not reported that here. The other way people may have been affected, of course, is whether COVID either directly affected their household, which this graphic shows, and we see it is over half of households that were either directly affected or probably were affected, or less than half that were. And we did, because we know this was a condition, ask people if they tested for that and it was confirmed or not. The other question we asked that were not reported here, but we've built into some of our Consumer Food Insights, is even if you haven't had COVID affect your household directly, there are those households who are far more meticulous about staying safe because someone in their house was vulnerable. So we also asked people if they had a vulnerable person in their household, and there was another third of the sample where that was the case. And then a couple of the questions below, you'll see that affect how we shared some of the results. So next slide. So the first thing we looked at, because again, this whole project was really framed about how did it affect a very specific set of food markets within the sector. And though the USDA does a fabulous job of reporting in some big categories like food at home and food away from home, we knew for this particular sector, getting a little more granular and breaking that down a little further has been helpful. So we did stay within some of the broad categories of food at home and food away from home, but again, looked at between 2 and 8 categories for those two groups. And then later you'll hear Mackenzie talk about how we also asked about their broader food acquisition, because it's not always in the marketplace, but increasingly we see there being some interactions between choices people are making in markets and how they secure their food otherwise. Next slide. Libby has put in the chat box, if you want to look at it, some of the specific examples that were given in the survey to guide the respondents about what we meant by these categories. Because although it gives us richer data, one of the challenges of adding more categories is making sure people are clear what you mean by that categorical name. So that document she just added into the chat box gives you a sense of, you want to keep checking back like a key of what we mean by these. So one of the first questions we ask is, did you try a new marketplace in the last year? And last year we found that about 37% of the sample had tried a new market. Well, persisting on for another year, we had yet again for the year after that, so up through last fall, another third of our sample again saying they're continuing to try new market channels. This is good for this sector because, again, the supermarkets and super centers are great and they play a good role, but they have been the dominant market channels. It tends to be the more that we see people doing fragmented shopping or going to more places, it's going to benefit local and regional food systems. So to give you a little more detail, you see what exactly types of markets they were trying new over the last year. And again, that's how we came to that 33%, and it was pretty well distributed among the categories that we gave them. And we'll go a little more deeply into some of these things as well. Next slide. So this starts getting busy, and I promise this is as busy as we'll get with our graphs, but then we kind of wanted to compared to that first fall of the pandemic and the next year. We wanted to look at how those usages had changed, because again, with the partners we have in this project, they were very happy to see some new customers coming through their door or buying from them online. Really started to call into question though, will this persist? Should I be making business strategies that expect this to continue? And then on the side of those of us who are providing community and technical assistance support, should we be changing the ways we're supporting our organizations because these are going to be changed permanently? And so this gives us a little better sense of how these might be persisting. Again, we're happy to see restaurants popping back up. We knew that was probably going to happen as some of the restrictions loosened up across the country. They would still tell you they're not fully recovered, but we were happy to see them bounce back, particularly our independent local restaurants. You continue to see supercenters and supermarkets be dominant, and that doesn't surprise anybody. But what's really good to see is that across this domain of local and regional food market channels, we've continued to see not just persistent use of those channels, but some increases depending on the category. So this is, again, not dollar amounts. This is the number of households that say they're shopping in those marketplaces at all, but we can go a little deeper. And we did ask them to recall weekly market channel expenditures. Now, I know all of you are sitting there going like, can people really remember what they bought a year ago? We did do some checks within the data to actually check and see if this lined up with what the Bureau of Labor Statistics says people are spending, and we're pretty darn close, except people in our sample were underestimating how much they were eating food away from home, and I'll return to that topic later. But we're pretty close on, and we think it's because we're not asking about a type of food, like what did you spend on ham? We're asking people where they shopped, and if you think of how credit card bills or transactions that come from your bank would show it, people kind of probably know what they're spending, and now they even know where, because that would be itemized. So we actually think people can recall channels better than they can any particular food product. But anyway, back to the slide, you'll see expenditures are up in October 21 in almost all of these channels. Even when you see them go down, Azita, who you'll be hearing from later, checked and they did not go down significantly. The three places we actually had them go up significantly were in supercenters, supermarkets, and I believe restaurants, of course, because they're recovering. But even these ones where you see it bobbling a little bit, it wasn't a significant difference. So again, we think this is pretty good news for this sector in the fact that the people who have found these new markets are staying in these new markets and spending in these new markets. We did not ask about institutional settings, although we'll talk about that a little bit in food acquisition later, Holly. Next slide. Again, no, we just went through a lot of data. These are going to be made available both in a summary of this webinar and Consumer Food Insights. But now we want to kind of turn it over to our panelists and their reflections about some of what we see here and what they think it might mean for our sector. Thank you.
So this webinar is going to be a little tricky because we're going to hop back and forth between conversation and data. And so bear with us. And if you have any questions or ideas, please put them in the chat box and we'll do our best to incorporate them as we kind of go. But also keep in mind that we will open up the conversation at the end and ask you guys to actually ask some questions. So first, before I turn it over to the panelists and ask questions of them, I want to ask Dawn, as having a token economist available to us, what role is inflation playing in these kind of spaces and conversations? And one thing that I've heard from working with farmers in my home state of Colorado is that local producers haven't been as quick to pass on the increased cost that they're seeing in terms of fertilizer, fuel to their consumers. And so the price between a local regional product and a price at the grocery store is actually getting closer. And so Donna, can you speak a little bit to inflation, particularly around food and in the local regional food space?
Yeah, and first I just want to say it's an interesting time to be a food and ag economist. This is probably the most dynamic things have been in my 30-year career. So I'll do my best to answer this, but a lot of this is still stuff for further exploration. We definitely know we're seeing food inflation. It was now recorded at 9% increase last year, overall categories. And so we definitely know perhaps even some of what we saw in those supermarkets and supercenter increases isn't just a return to them, but it actually might be, they have been the quickest to reflect the cost changes. And I have also heard from some people that we work with in local and food channels is not all, but some of the costs that are inflating that are putting that cost pressure on food producers aren't felt quite as strongly even among local and regional. For instance, shipping costs. We're not shipping as far. So I definitely think that's part of the story. The other thing we have to remember is the food at home and food away from home continuums probably changed. It used to be very distinct, and I think it's gotten very gray between people going and picking up food. And right, so if you pick up something from a grocery store and it's all made, you're just taking it home and eating it there. Is it food at home or is it food away from home? And the reason that's important for this discussion is when we have consumers seeking out meal kits or foods prepared at a grocery store ready to take home and eat, there is more labor and more cost built into that. So some of that inflationary pressure might not even be food per se. It might be the additional labor people are putting on things that are quicker to eat. So there's so many dimensions to that, only some of which we probably can dig into in this particular survey. But I think we definitely can actually add some insights, at least, to the discussion that's happening on those. So great question.
And Dawn, I think that's a great segue for us to turn our attention to Ashley, because there's no commercial kitchen. We didn't see commercial kitchen as one of those call out boxes. And so I wonder if you can speak to what is the kind of role of commercial kitchens, particularly in this time of growing demand? And are you hearing from your network that there is a growing demand?
Thanks, Libby. Yeah, so I would say, commercial kitchens wasn't necessarily a category. I think of commercial kitchens more as a proxy. So these kitchens are representing a plethora, I like to use that word occasionally, of other food businesses. And we actually are able to see trends a lot quicker than when they get to the national level. And so I think that there's a really important role these commercial kitchens play, because they are, again, the first stop that a new food business goes to become a legal entity and to produce food at a licensed commercial space. So becoming real. I kind of wanted to segue off of what Dawn was saying about inflation, and something really interesting that happened systemically during the pandemic was this move to delivery and move to convenience. And in a sense, it was the perfect storm for companies like DoorDash and all of these delivery companies, because all of a sudden they had the attention of the country, essentially, that wanted this convenience, that wanted delivery. And in a lot of ways, they were subsidizing that delivery. And so they were making it so easy, and so, people were just doing it. Now we're facing a little bit more of a reckoning where, we haven't paid for the labor that it takes to do that, or the extra gas prices there, or the extra packaging that it takes to do that. And so during the pandemic, everyone got really used to this delivery and convenience sort of thing. And now we're starting to see that it might not be as tangible or realistic for most consumers to be able to do that once or twice a week, as we thought during the pandemic, where everything was moving that direction. So I am seeing things kind of slowing down as it pertains to that kind of delivery aspect. And we can talk a little bit more about the labor side. But as far as what happened in our commercial kitchens, just like with everything, we saw, the great pause where, all our kitchens, pretty much shut down. No one was renting space. People were just trying to figure out what was going on. But I also think we were one of the first industries to see a rebound. And I think there's a few things that were going on that led to that. Specifically, companies that were doing events, caterers, chefs, product food trucks and food carts, all of those folks didn't know what to do, but they were still licensed in a commercial space. They still had their food handler card, and they knew how to produce food. And so many of them looked for new ways to service what was happening in their communities. We saw a lot of those food businesses move into community food security, where they were now producing food for institutions and institutional buyers. We saw a lot of new vendors come into the space. So not the ones that were already in the space, but those that were adapting to what was happening, and making things like kombucha, gourmet popcorn, empanadas, cold pressed coffee, baked goods, cold juices, dips and sauces, alternative proteins. These are the trendy things that we're seeing over and over and over again, kind of bubbling up. But also, how do you service these families at home that need meals, and many people that don't really want to leave their homes very often? So one of the things I saw in the data that was very interesting is people wanted to continue to go to supermarkets. And I think the reason for that is because it was probably one of the safer channels maybe to buy food, but you only had to stop in one place. Whereas if you're going to, you have to go to the baker, and then you have to go to the meat shop, and then you have to go to the cheese guy. People didn't want to go to multiple places. They wanted to support local, and they wanted to support their local folks in the local restaurants, but they didn't want to be traveling to multiple places. And so what we saw as a response to that was a more aggregated approach. So many of our kitchens were acting as an aggregation point for pickups. They were acting as, they were creating online like farmers market type sites where folks could purchase from multiple vendors that produce in these shared kitchens. And then there was a lot of those meal kit type things where people were able to kind of pick up meals and you could buy from the different vendors. So we saw a lot of food hall. They call it kind of a food hall, where it's either like a already prepared food or even add-ons of other products that can be put into that. So those were kind of the fast responses we've seen, and also some of the things that I feel like are continuing, because I think folks still want the convenience and they still want to support local, but they want to do it in like these new channels. And I think technology is going to continue to play a big role in the aggregation side of all of that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ashley. And Wes, in some of the conversations that we had in preparation for this webinar, we talked a little bit about how, like Ashley's, like the visibility of the local regional food sector was top of mind, and we saw this kind of tremendous period of tremendous growth. And one of the things that you briefly mentioned, I'm hoping that you can expand a little bit about, is that there are some folks that saw that response, that ability to respond to that growing demand, as showing that the food system is working just fine, like it's working perfectly. And so I wonder if you can speak a little bit of that, and what are the opportunities for taking ownership of this narrative in this unique moment that we're in terms of seeing this growth moving forward?
Yeah, sure. First, maybe I would say that maybe not an example that the food system was working perfectly, but the viability of local and regional food systems. I think what we saw was actually the food system as a whole was not working properly, but then there was these bright spots where local and regional food systems and markets were working. And part of what I was kind of thinking about when we were talking previously, I was reflecting on the fact that when I started doing this work over 10 years ago, back in Illinois, we were trying to convince the state government there to be more supportive of local and regional food systems. And one of the core arguments that we were making at that time was disaster preparedness. That we live in a world in which everything is, just in time. The supply chains throughout this country were just in time. Food showed up a few days before the people who were going to pick it up. By and large, the distribution systems, the supermarkets, the grocery stores only had a few days of food actually on their shelves. That in the situation of some sort of disruption of supply chains, that we would really have a serious situation. And we always pointed out the irony of living in Illinois, one of the most major agriculture production states in the country when it comes to commodities, that we lived in a place in which if there were major disruptions to the supply chains that brought food to our grocery stores, there would be real issues. And that's why we needed to invest in local and regional food systems. We needed to make sure that we had small, mid-sized farms producing not just commodities that get shipped to another part of the country to get processed into other products that then get shipped to another part of the country. We needed that actual local ability to feed ourselves. And I think one of the things that was really exciting in the pandemic is you saw proof of concept of this, that you saw in many regions in which you had established small farms that had good markets, good networks, and good relationships already in their community, that they were able to step up right away and provide food for those in need, whether that's through straight up consumers going to purchase it from those farms, or things that we saw in terms of the Farmers to Family Food Box program, where suddenly these small farms were able to step up, work together, and meet some of these needs that suddenly couldn't be met because of disruptions in supply chains.
Awesome, thank you, Wes. And Nichelle, there's a question that came up from the chat box that I'm curious about getting your perspective on. Dawn spoke about how the lines are blurring between away from home and at home. And if we think that the federal government currently uses that distinction as important for data collection, there are questions about how much do you spend away from home and at home. And so I didn't prep you for this, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the relationship between what's happening on the ground, the reality of people's lived experience, and the way that particular questions are formed at the federal level that are used to inform kind of policy moving forward.
Yeah, and actually that, looking at the slides earlier, that is something that I had also thought about. So NASS, the National Ag Statistical Service, is the agency that typically collects a lot of ag data across the US. And so I went back to one of their last ag surveys, which was the 2017 ag census, and they do collect some data on local food practices, but it seems like they ask two questions, right? What is the value of food sold directly to consumers? And what is the value of food that you sell to retail markets, institutions, food hubs, or other local and regionally branded products? So they aren't really asking the questions that we are talking about here today. So there is opportunity to influence how NASS thinks about the data that it collects for local and regional foods. And Wes, you may know this, but they do actually have a separate local food marketing survey that goes out every 5-6 years or so, that really is to get to the nitty-gritty of what this particular avenue looks like. And that is also another avenue where we can shape what type of data NASS is collecting.
Awesome, thank you for being flexible in my on-the-spot question. Okay, so we're gonna jump back into the data. Everybody be excited.
All right. How's it going, everybody? I'm Jairus Rossi. I'm a research professor at University of Kentucky. And the next two slides we're going to look at are really, again, I think Libby mentioned that this is sort of an extension of some things we did in the first survey. So my interest here really is about how community size might impact how consumers purchase food from local food market channels, both before and during, and I guess during. There's no after, I guess, anymore, the pandemic. So community size, at least the way we were thinking about it, we would expect it to have an impact on local food purchasing, because individuals' ability to access specific food market channel options is different depending on maybe the size of your community or your region. Different places, different size places experienced COVID very differently. Some places had more restrictions on how market channels could operate, and the relative intensity of the pandemic in different places at different times. It hit urban areas and at certain times, more rural areas later on. You didn't really see that in the sort of the incidence rates that Libby posted before, but that was really interesting to get a whole sense of how this pandemic has spread and changed in intensity over time. But that it's changed depending on where you are and how big your community is. And then really community size, you can maybe think about how people have different attitudes towards risk. So the way that I split everything up in this survey, I used the rural urban continuum codes, but I split up all the responses in 3 ways: metro counties above 1 million people, metro counties below 1 million people, that's your blue bar, and the non-metro counties, which is your green bars. So again, my focus is looking at market channels where you might expect to find local food. And I've included supermarkets just as a useful comparison, since we all go there, and I guess 75% of people go there according to the data that we saw before. But the percentages here, they represent increases or decreases in weekly expenditure for each market channel at different points in time. And so for this first slide, the different points in time are the before times, September 2019, compared to about September 2020, when you started to see a dip in the incidence rates of COVID. You saw some restrictions being lifted from the initial lockdowns of the pandemic. You saw restaurants in some venues reopening. You saw consumers trying to figure out what their own comfort level is with going to different types of market types. So this time interval really tries to assess how people were adapting at that time to the ongoing pandemic. And so I think what you see here, with supermarkets, you got increases regardless of community size in that initial kind of interval. In other retail style venues with local foods, we saw a more complex picture. So if you look at the small format grocery, which would include IGAs, co-ops, Trader Joe's type places, we saw that the smaller metro areas, the metro under 1 million counties, we saw an increase in spending at these small format groceries, and all the other size communities had slight decreases. But then when you look at something like specialty markets, like delis, bakeries, fish markets, butchers, you saw increases in large metro areas, but decreases in the other two size communities. And then you had health food stores, which I guess would be Whole Foods, natural grocers. There were increases across the board, but most significantly where you might not expect it, which is in non-metro counties, given that many probably don't have a Whole Foods. So in short, the changes that you see in these retail style local food purchasing, they really differ depending on community size. And perhaps that suggests that individuals were, they're looking for different types of venues that were either less crowded or which had maybe missing items that were missing from conventional retail at that time due to supply chain. Now, if you move to more direct markets, if you look at something like farmers market, you saw that there's an increase in community size, or you saw expenditure increases weekly were increasing for all community sizes, though the small metro class had the largest increase. Direct from producer expenditures, so this would be the one that includes CSA. You only saw an increase in the larger metro communities and actually decreases in the other two sizes. So maybe, I don't know what the explanation would be at this time, but maybe people in more urban communities were trying to find reasons to get out of the city, or maybe, again, it was a supply chain issue. Creating relationships directly with a farmer could relieve some of those pressures. We did see that there was, I guess there were some questions about CSA, but we did see, at least in another organization I'm working with, metrics that would indicate that during this time there was a large jump in CSA purchasing, maybe not regardless of where you are, but in many places across the country. Now, if you look at something like food boxes, now this is not CSA, this would be more aggregated multi-farm CSA maybe, or the federal food box programs. We saw large expenditure increases in all community sizes, and you'll see what happens with that later on, but that was an interesting increase across the board. And then finally, we saw restaurant expenditures increasing only in smaller communities. And as we know, during this time interval, we had a lot of places that either had to shut down due to mandates or safety concerns, or maybe just business decisions that it wasn't really worth, continuing your local food restaurant or your independent restaurant. And so, there was some increases in the smaller communities, but not so much in the other two. All right, Libby, can you get to the next slide, please? So then with our new survey data, we sort of took that last point in time and then we compared it with a year from then. So October 2020 to October 2021. And you see a further evolution of these initial adaptations. The pandemic kept going on, people got vaccinated, people had a different maybe perspective on risk taking, but the patterns that people started to get into may have continued. There may have been some regression, like maybe not as many people were doing CSA as was mentioned in the chat box. But one thing really just to notice here is that with weekly expenditure changes, the changes regardless of direction, they're much greater in magnitude for all channels. So for instance, we see continued increases in weekly expenditures of supermarkets, which Don covered a little bit before. And when you look at more of the locally focused retail channels, things like specialty markets, it's a really interesting case here. Like in the previous interval of time, only the large metro areas increased in purchases. All others decreased. But now here we have large increases for the other two size classes, while the large metro stayed the same. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. And again, all of this data, I'd be interested to hear from others to see if any of this coheres with their experience of things that they've seen on a local level. Small format grocery stores, again, that would be like IGAs and independent grocers, Trader Joe's. We saw increases in small metro communities, which is the only place you saw increases in weekly expenditures. And that is the exact same trend that we saw in the previous interval. So, but just in general, we see increased expenditures at locally focused retail venues compared to a year ago for most community sizes. So that's sort of interesting. And then farmers market expenditures are up for large metro and non-metro communities. And in the previous survey, small metro had the largest increase, but now we're seeing a decrease there. Direct purchasing is down or unchanged for most communities. And perhaps this is suggesting that the previous large increases in the larger metro areas was really motivated by either getting out of the city or supply chain issues. CSA is in this category again, so that might help answer some of the questions about CSA increasing or decreasing. I mean, again, with the other metrics that we have, we do still see increases in some parts of the country and some decreases in others. And so that's a really complicated thing to look at, but I see that the decreases here, that to me, that's really interesting, and I'd like to know more about why that's happening. Maybe it's because it's such a niche market and not that many people know about it or understand or are participating in it. So I'm not really sure what to make of the food box changes. They're so wildly divergent, but again, we had talked about this before we came in here and suggested that maybe this was the addition of meat could cause, like it was basically, when you look at the small metro, you see a gigantic increase from previous weekly expenditures last year to this year. Really, that just represents something like a change in $22 per week to something like $30 a week for not too many observations. So be interested to know what's going on there. And finally, people are spending more at local restaurants now than in a year ago. And I think we saw that a little bit in the number of households who in a year ago said that they were going to local restaurants, which is something like 34%. And now it's up to 50%, which to me was like, that was a surprising figure to see. But I would be interested, again, you see the smaller communities actually having the largest increase in weekly expenditures. So I'd be interested to know whether others have observed new restaurants opening in smaller communities recently, or if you have any perspective on that. So just in short here, just to finish up, I think we're seeing weekly expenditures continuing to increase for a lot of local markets, a lot of different size classes. And so where you do see increases, they're actually larger in magnitude than in the previous interval. But really that loss in direct from farmer purchasing, that needs more investigation because I'm not quite sure what's going on there. And I think, yeah, we all might be interested in that. So again, I wish we could do some more regional differences, but when you looked at the map, you can see that most of the responses we have are either West Coast, East Coast, and Midwest. And there's a lot of spots in the map where there aren't a lot of observations. So, but we'll continue to try to figure some of that out. And then I think who's next? Is it Mackenzie?
No, it's back to Dawn. I promise you guys won't hear from me much more, but we did know one of the things we saw last year as a big jump, and it might explain even differences across some of these community sizes, is this move to online platforms. And a couple of our panelists already referred to this, that this was a big change from last year. So one thing we did to even follow up on what we did last year is we quickly realized that the shift to online wasn't all the same either. There's a pretty distinct difference, particularly for the business models of some of our local and regional markets, where the expectation was for what they call last mile delivery, where those online purchases also had to get to someone's home directly and be shipped there, versus ones where they just didn't want to go into the marketplace. They did the online purchase, but they were willing to come to the site to do the curb pickup. So in this survey, we actually disentangled those this year. And so you can see those differences as well. And again, supercenters and supermarkets not only are some of the places that's happening the most, but also, as we know, they're the biggest share of sales as well. And not surprisingly, that's also showing up in the restaurant category, because we all know those models were used by different households depending on what their preferences were. What I thought was interesting to us is we saw both models being used in those local and regional food markets as well. And again, the reason I think that's important is two things. They're very different business models for producers because of the extra cost and needs and perhaps perishability for the delivery model versus the curb pickup model. But also, if you want to believe some of this is being driven by health concerns, those curb pickup people may be more likely to be indicating this isn't about them not wanting to come to a market, it's about their perceived safety of coming to a market. So in that vein of interest, if we look at the next slide, this is very busy, but we disentangled that. So the blue bars of different shades are that curb pickup response, but we differentiated. So the darker bar represents those households who either had COVID and tested positively for COVID during this period, or had someone in their household who was susceptible to, they felt were vulnerable enough they needed to keep from being exposed to COVID. So you'll see, not surprisingly, in all cases, both in the blue bars, which were curbside pickup, and in delivery, which are the green bars, that those who were susceptible to the COVID and had concerns about that public health consideration were more likely to use both models, both curb pickup and delivery. Again, the darker blue bars and darker green bars are those susceptible households. And so again, we don't know, but if there was concern that some of this is temporary and will go away, we would more likely think it was temporary among those darker bar households who it's a short-term consideration of the public health concerns they're trying to manage, rather than this is the preference for what they'll want to do long-term for the procurement. But we've also heard anecdotes of now that people have hit the tipping point and adopted this new practice, which is always hard for people to do, they may stay with it because they find there's also time saving, convenience, and so forth. That said, if you think about this, this is not going to be the same across all categories of foods. Some people are very comfortable letting a in-store shopper pick out their ketchup or paper towels or canned soup. But for those things we're good at in local food markets, fresh produce, meat, dairy, bakery, things that freshness and quality matter, that's where we might win with those people breaking off and going to local markets if they could do all their procurement of those staple goods from an online delivery service. So this is things, again, yet to be dug into, but I think there's some interesting things to think about here. So again, hopefully this is one of the other big trends we had, and it helps you disentangle in your head what might be driving different parts of that.
Wonderful.
So on to our panelists' reflections on what they just heard. Libby.
Yeah, so I'm going to change up the order a little bit. And one of the things that we heard from...
Oh, I forgot, Libby. I was going to say, folks, we know we're atypical in that we're an hour and a half webinar instead of an hour webinar. You will not offend us if you have to drop off. There will be a webinar summary shared with you, so feel free to go if you need to. But we're so glad so many of you are sticking with us into this next half hour if you can.
It'll be really exciting. Don't leave. Promise. We're going to get into some food acquisition, some values, very exciting stuff. But I want to turn to Wes and Ashley. So one of the things that we heard in our March webinar from Brian Compum, who works with the Colorado Department of Ag, is a really important, serious reflection on what is the role of government in supporting, encouraging innovation, kind of in this market sector space. And so I want to get your two perspectives because you are very different spaces. And so I'm curious what your reflections are as we go into this space of rapid changes of consumer trends. What is the role of government in that space?
That's a good question. I mean, having been involved in kind of the USDA AMS grant programs for years, both as a grant reviewer and a steward of public funds, who was evaluating projects, as well as someone that's applied for projects and or helped other community partners to apply. And I know we're not specifically talking about just those grants, but I think that that's where I feel like I can add some value, is that there's a lot of funds and money there. And I think no one on this call is going to be surprised to know that, but even though the money is there and accessible, it's still really hard to access. Because if you don't have the right infrastructure, if you don't have the track record, if you don't have the reporting, set up, if you've never managed a grant that large before, if you don't have a grant writer, if your project doesn't fit exactly in the box, I mean, these are the biggest constraints. But I also, from the perspective of the federal government, know that like diligence is important when giving money to communities, and we want to make sure that we're, giving that money to projects that have a potential success rate or a higher success rate. So I'll just leave it at that, because I feel like everyone on this call already kind of knows that kind of stuff. Where I feel like there's opportunity is, and relating back to what we've been talking about with these huge seismic shifts that happened during COVID, is that there was a lot more move online. And the first responders to the online stuff were, a lot of the technology companies, a lot of the really big technology companies that have venture capital that's, flooding through, and they're able to basically pay for customer acquisition at a huge rapid rate, getting there first and owning the market. And so the local and regional system has to find ways to kind of catch up with that in a lot of ways. And I think that's kind of potentially impossible, except for the fact that we all know that local and regional food systems tend to be relational and not transactional. And I think a lot of these large, VC-backed food companies and technology companies they're very transactional. They're going by their KPIs. They're measuring, one thing, where our KPIs, key performance indicators, are measuring very different things. And we tend to be more relational. And so how you catch up or find common ground to get there is something to be, I think, discussed. I think that there's a role that governments play. I think that in this question that I'm looking at is kind of like, can the state departments of agriculture versus the federal government be closer to these projects and this innovation that's happening? I think there's a potential for that. But I think maybe the whole thing needs to be kind of shaken up a bit and think more like some of these big companies and how they do these pitch events and how they do these funding, and like just maybe the way we approach it can get shaken up or at least trialed in a different way. I don't know if that's possible, but that would be, maybe just there's a new way we need to look at it.
Actually, I always love your insights because you charge us to think big, and I always really appreciate that. And the sky is the limit, and I love that. So Wes, let's hear from you.
Yeah. So first I'll say, kind of the question of the role of government funding to support innovation, as it may not come as a surprise, as an organization who is advocating for more federal investment in food systems, I think there's an important role. And one of the things I would say what that role is and why I see that important role kind of somewhat builds on some of the things that Ashley said, this discussion about the different KPIs that you mentioned. That's not language I use, but it really fits with what I was thinking. And so I think of local and regional food systems as a values-based, or trying to incorporate additional values into an economic, a political economic kind of system. By and large, in our country, the profit motive is the most important value that drives all activity in the marketplace. What we're talking about is trying to incorporate other values. And as a result of trying to incorporate other values such as local, that doesn't have the kind of financial backing or the VC capitalists that Ashley was mentioning. So where does this investment come from? It's not necessarily going to come from those trying to make profit, because their most important value is profit. Where if we want to try to incorporate other values into the economic system, that is where I see as a really important role of government and government funding. With that said, one of the things that I want to bring it back to some of the things that I said in the last section that I think would be really fascinating to look at in terms of research and see, is there correlations between those communities that may have had increased direct market, farmers market, overall local and regional food system sales during the early pandemic with previous philanthropy and government investments in local and regional food systems in those regions? I have a feeling, or at least I hope is the case, that in those communities in which we already had previous government investment in innovations in the food system, you find more connections, more networks, more relationships that were then in place and ready to respond and come, basically address the crisis of the pandemic. This is a hunch, but I would love to see some of that kind of research. If we can see whether or not previous investments have led to some of these better outcomes during the pandemic.
Can I just make another comment? Because I own a technology company, so I feel like I could easily become like the whipping post here, which I'm fine with that. But my company we're a values-based company and a mission-based organization. So our mission is to enable efficiency, growth, and innovation in local food. And we do that through a technology platform. And the reason I chose this technology platform is because through the technology, we're building access. So we're trying to make the invisible visible. So no one knew where these shared kitchens were before we built a database and a place to search for them and a place to schedule them and access them online. So I think that there's a role technology plays in, people are online, and it actually can in a lot of ways be the great equalizer that we all want, but it's really about how we approach that. And I know there's some comments in the box around the challenges of the technologies inserting themselves in the middle. And essentially that's what we've done with our company, is we've built this infrastructure that connects two things. And yes, I have to pay my employees, and I provide them healthcare benefits. And I do all the things that a company would do for my employees. But we are also leveraging, 250 shared use kitchens across the country and 10,000 food businesses that are accessing those commercial kitchens, because we're just looking at things in a different way. And so I think it's just kind of the perspective and the glasses you want to put on. And I also realize that this is all a continuum, right? That these values-based things, which I know we're going to talk about a lot more, are at the core of what we're trying to do. But I feel like I feel like my approach has been through technology to build and generate and create that access. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Wonderful. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And owning that there is a space for that, and the need for technology and being able to use it as a tool, and that in and of itself isn't necessarily something to assign bad things to. And Nichelle, I'm thinking about the speed at which things change. The fact that one of the things that I always find interesting about this project is the community is not just consumers, but also, as Ashley just mentioned, 10,000 food businesses. They are a community. And so I'm curious if you can speak to what tools or mechanisms exist to rapidly communicate needs of these different types of communities to policymakers. So what tools do you find most effective in conveying a story about needs to policymakers?
So that's a good question. It's not only what tools to use to convey the message, but what message would actually be heard. The most effective way is simply, and it's not anything super complicated, it's simply picking up the phone and calling your congressperson or state legislator person for a call on a discussion on whatever topic of conversation that you're wanting to have. That is the most direct way, and it's a way that you as the constituent have to bring your concerns or comments to your particular lawmaker. They do respond. You may get a email saying, thank you for coming, where we had a great discussion, we'll follow up or keep in touch or whatever. But it's, I think, most important to prepare what your talking points are. Make sure that the message that you want to convey will land with your particular lawmaker. And it's also important to follow up. So it's not just having one conversation and then you hope that they do something, you know, in a bill or something. It is following up. It is also bringing together, because like you said, there are many stakeholders involved in this entire process. It is also bringing together those stakeholders, maybe having some type of forum where you invite your lawmaker to attend, or you bring those stakeholders to your lawmaker to discuss the issues at hand. That is one avenue that NSAC tends to use. We have farmer fly-ins every year, and it's an annual process where we bring in farmers from across the country to talk to their lawmakers about what are those programs that are important to them. And we just finished one fly-in, which was particularly successful, and we've heard from lawmakers that, you know, they really appreciated learning more about some of the challenges that folks are facing on the ground. So that is, it's not really a tool, but I think that is one method of getting your voice in front of the folks that are making those decisions.
Wonderful. So I think we're going to turn it back to Dawn, you're up again, sorry, to talk about values and motivations.
Yeah, so another thing that we're going to spend a little bit of time on is trying to understand who are these people who are both coming to these markets and attending these markets and spending money at these markets. So we're going to present this in a couple different ways. We asked people about some of the values they hold, and you'll hear a little bit more from Azita, but in addition to asking what we always do is how important are things to you? Because for some people, everything is important. We kind of made them be a little more discerning this year and pick the top 3 things that for their household really motivates their food purchases. And not surprisingly, and the reason these add up to more than 100% is because they could choose 3. The most important things still out there are affordability, healthfulness, and convenience and availability. That's not surprising. We're not going to change all US households to change the way they do food behavior. And this very much aligns with what we saw, that supercenters and supermarkets are still the most likely way people are going to shop. What's great news for us is that there are a significant and increasing number of households who are finding one of their top 3 motivations are things that align with the business models we see are specifically aligned with our markets. It's not that our markets can't be affordable, healthy, and convenient, but that's where we have to compete head to head with other people. Where we can really shine is telling the story of how we support the local economy, where things are being grown. Oftentimes people are choosing to grow them in eco-friendly ways, and being able to share, just like Ashley did, that they're putting money back into their economy, they're giving out good jobs, they're treating their labor well. And so I think these are things we really need to keep top of mind as we, the reason we're sharing this is this is the way we start redeveloping our marketing campaigns, our word of mouth campaigns. So now I'm going to let Azita go a little deeper into how those values also vary across where people are shopping.
Thank you, Dr. Tilmany. My name is Azita. I'm 4th-year PhD student from University of Kentucky, and I'm going to talk about food values. We are interested in looking at how consumer food values vary from supermarkets to local and regional food systems channels. For the food values part of the survey, we asked respondents to rank the importance of 16 values. These values are divided into food values and COVID-related restrictions. We explored how consumers rank the values in local and regional food system channels compared to supermarkets. Here we divided the local and regional food system channels into food at home market channels and food away from home markets. As you see, consumers rated the importance of locally grown products, organic food, and support for local economy in farmers market higher than in supermarkets. Surprisingly, we see that consumers value the importance of having purchasing method options such as online ordering and delivery higher for farmers markets, which could be related to COVID restrictions that had already more affected shopping from farmers market than supermarkets. Like what we saw for farmers market, we can also see that for direct from producer and food box delivery, consumers rated the locally grown food, organic food, and support the local economy higher than supermarkets. Also, consumers believe that purchasing products that can meet cultural preferences is more important for these two channels than supermarket. And COVID restriction also affected shopping from these channels more compared to supermarkets. For the food away from home markets, consumer rated the importance of supporting the local economy, buying products that meet their cultural preference and feeling confident in the safety protocols in bakeries more than in supermarkets. So, and for the local restaurant, consumer expressed that for these restaurants, the importance of the value of impacting the local economy is higher than in supermarkets. Otherwise, they rated the other values similar to national restaurants and supermarkets. So we see here that values are related to consumer food purchase. So this is just my slide, and I'm gonna hand it off to Mackenzie.
Actually, Mackenzie, would you like me to handle this one, or do you want to take it?
Oh, I can start now.
Great.
So we know from previous research that school meals feed about 84% of food insecure households and school-aged children. And most studies find that participation in the school meal program is associated with significantly lower rates of food insecurity for households with children, as well as improved diet quality and academic performance. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about how the experiences of households with children during the pandemic and what happened at the onset of the pandemic up until now. So if we could just go to the next slide. When schools closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic in March 2022, many low-income and food insecure households with children had to quickly pivot where they were purchasing and acquiring food. So this graph looks at the subset of households that were using the school meal program prior to the pandemic. It shows different rates of food acquisition methods over time. So the darkest blue represents the pre-pandemic era. The light blue represents the onset of the pandemic in April 2020. And the gray represents the new normal sort of era in September 2020. And I wanted to start with the 2020 data in order to basically give some context to the story that the 2021 data tells. So usage of SNAP and EBT, and as well as WIC, both increased among households participating in the school meal program from prior to the pandemic to its onset in April 2020, but then decreased below pre-pandemic levels in both cases by September 2020. We think that the 3% increase in the SNAP and EBT participation in April 2020 may reflect new usage of the pandemic EBT dollars, which was a program that replaced the lost access to the school meal program for households that were using it. Unexpectedly, food pantry utilization decreased throughout the pandemic, throughout this time, which may reflect the relative inconvenience of food pantry acquisition compared to other types of food assistance. Or additionally, after speaking with someone at our local food bank here, it may reflect the fact that consumers are less able to choose their food at food banks compared to other types of food assistance. So many food banks switched to a drive-through format, and participants were then not able to shop at the food pantry in the same way that they used to be able to. So importantly, we find that the number of households participating in the school meal program did not fully recover once most schools reopened in September 2020. So you can see this is the further on the right, the two columns on the right. We find that the number of households, only 36% were participating in September 2020. And we saw this trend continue in our 2021 data. So you can go to the next slide. So from October 2020 to October 2021, school meal program participation increased by just a modest 2%. So first of all, it's important to note that in our analysis, one caveat is that this subset includes households with children aged 0 to 5, and this may skew our participation results downward. However, data from the National Center for Education Statistics reported that around 67% of households with school-aged children used distance learning in September 2020. So these low participation rates might indicate that many eligible households are continuing to use the pandemic EBT program rather than the school meal program, which requires in-person attendance. We find that households who did continue to use the school meal program in October 2020 or October 2021, many reported still struggling with food insecurity. So around 73% of households reported either sometimes or often running out of food and being unable to afford more. And 23% of these households did not utilize SNAP assistance, which implied that federal efforts to mitigate food insecurity by allocating emergency funds either through the pandemic EBT program or increased SNAP were definitely warranted, but may not have reached all households, all eligible households. Many parents had to make the choice about whether or not to send their children either back to school or enroll in hybrid or remote learning. So for eligible households, this choice determined whether they would participate in the school meal program or the pandemic EBT assistance. And these graphs show that these are some economic impacts that give insights into the factors that households had to consider when making this decision. We see that 54% of households experienced lost income from either losing a job or being furloughed or from reduced hours or income at their job. Yet still 60% of respondents in this subset of households reported being an essential worker. So not only were these households at a higher risk of experiencing food insecurity from lost income, but they also were more likely to be less available to supervise children who were learning at home. And then lastly, I just want to connect these findings to the impact on local and regional food systems. So there are trade-offs in the supply chain implied from these policy changes. The school meal program and pandemic EBT programs impact demand for commodities in different ways. And commodities are federally purchased for preparation of school meals, while pandemic EBT can be spent anywhere that shoppers are able to redeem their EBT benefits. So increased allocation to food assistance is correlated with increased expenditures by consumers, which then indirectly impacts market participants along the supply chain. And in conclusion, both the pandemic EBT and school meal program definitely serve important purposes in the food assistance space, but the relatively high percentages of families that are reporting food insecurity still may warrant continued allocation of funds toward food assistance. And with that, I'll hand it back to Libby.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mackenzie and Azita, for those insights around food acquisition and motivations and in values. And we've only got 5 minutes more left of the panel and the webinar. And so I have a few more questions, but I want to first offer it to the rest of the participants. If you guys have any questions, or if Dawn, if you've been reviewing the chat box, if there was anything that came up that you guys haven't addressed in the chat box, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, well, Mackenzie, there was a couple questions about, some clarification on, benefits were up at different points in time of this pandemic. And then if, the breakout of CEP schools, which I don't even know what CEP means. So you can either address this, but also remember, folks, part of the reason we did this webinar at this point is we're writing up the Consumer Food Insights. So if we don't answer them today, what we might do is take your questions as prompts for things we actually will break out in our Food Insights, because you guys are telling those are of interest. Oh, community eligibility program, yeah. So if Mackenzie wants to answer those quick, or if any panelists want to reflect, but Mackenzie, we might more just take some of these comments and make sure they're embedded in what you do write up on the Consumer Food Insights. But if you have quick answers to any of them, please do share.
Yeah, so I can give a quick answer just as a point of clarification. Yes, so there were increases in allocations of funds during this time, and increases in redemption of benefits during the pandemic. But so that graph was, the first graph for 2020 was just representing participation rates of the different food assistance programs by households who were participating in the school meal program prior to the pandemic. So we were really interested in how those households sort of had to pivot in their choices of how they acquired food after the onset of the pandemic. And I'm not sure about the CEP question, but I will take a look into that and get back to you.
And again, we understand people have to go. We still shortened our slides and we still ran long this year. This is just really rich data to dig into. So forgive us that we keep filling the time up so fully. So go as you need to, but we'll just stick around a couple more minutes in case people have other questions or the panelists want to reflect quick before we wrap up. But again, no offense if you need to get going, and know you'll be getting access to these materials over the next few weeks. So thank you for coming if you need to go. But again, panelists, want to give us one wrap up insight as we close out today?
I have a couple comments. Just we did a lot at the end of this, and I kept making notes. So I have a couple things to say on a couple of the previous speakers as well. Interesting thing about the community food security elements is we also noticed in our shared kitchens a lot of makers starting to support community food security through programs. So Meals on Wheels, increases in those types of programs, increases in the school lunch programs, and different distribution channels at housing developments, and all different kinds of programs. So we did see these, again, kitchens acting as these hubs for local food security in a lot of ways as well. So I thought that was really interesting. Earlier, Jarius was talking about, I thought it was really interesting how variable the times or the responses were based on the size of the communities. And I thought he, alluded to something that was interesting, is that everyone was experiencing the pandemic in different ways depending on the size of your community. And I thought that was really interesting, because the rural people at first were like, well, I'm not seeing this isn't happening, in my community, but the urban areas were like getting hit really hard. And then there was this lag. And so consumers' behavior changed along with what they were seeing directly in their communities. And I think that's probably what's leading to such a strange variability in those different areas. So I thought that was interesting. And then another thing that was interesting is, like, it's a pandemic. And so maybe we didn't talk about it as much as we should have been, maybe in like local press or media, but like health is wealth, and preventative health and supporting your own, like what you can do to support your own health from getting sick or potentially getting sick, in a significant way was to eat well and exercise. And so what's interesting through a lot of this data is we've seen a move towards more health food and more direct to consumer and more farmers market channels. And I thought that makes a lot of sense, that people were kind of like, oh, I need to take care of myself and where I purchase food, and my health is important. We also saw an increase in types of healthcare products being produced in a lot of kitchens, so that's not too surprising. And then the last thing I wanted to say was, it was a good one, and I can't see where I put it. All right, I guess that was it. My notes are a mess.
I just, one thing that I would kind of end on is that, one of the things that's going to be really exciting, at least from my perspective as somebody who's working in the federal policy world, is what happens with the next farm bill. So the next federal farm bill is supposed to be authorized in 2023. And we've seen, I think the pandemic has exposed, positives and negatives in terms of the ability of our community food security systems to respond to people's hunger and nutrition needs. And how are those lessons? How are some of the things that we heard here about the importance of EBT technology relative to PEBT, or what happened with farmers, happened with food boxes and food pantries? How is all this going to show up in the Farm Bill? I think there's going to be really interesting discussions looking at how some of these various iterations of the programs, as well as this new local food purchasing assistance program that's been started by the USDA, what are the results going to be? How do they fit with each other iteratively? And what kind of new policy innovations in terms of those government funding innovations or investments in innovation are we going to see come up in the new Farm Bill? I hope there's going to be some really exciting things. And to the point, some of the points that Nichelle made earlier, we're going to need, for those of us who are advocating for these kind of things, we're going to need all of you in whatever capacity you can play to help make those cases and help connect those dots so that we do get better policy coming out of the next Farm Bill when it comes to responding to disasters, pandemics, and the need for better nutrition security.
Wes, I think you're totally right. And I also think, related to what Mackenzie showed is that, that the increased usage of the SNAP and EBT, a lot of that came out in the farmers market data. It's probably, we saw increases at farmers market of usage of those benefits. That's a direct link and a great policy platform from which to stand on and tell that story of how these two things are so intimately connected. So I totally agree with you.
And I would just say, just sort of echoing Wes's point about thinking about 2023 Farm Bill. Yes, researchers do have a role to play in terms of getting that message across to those who are making those decisions when it comes to Farm Bill. You guys have presented a lot of data here today. That data can be used to influence how do we support local and regional food programs in the next Farm Bill. But what is really key is to have a really great ask, right? So you have a lot of data, so can we distill that into an ask that resonates on the Hill so that we can use that to influence the final outcome of the Farm Bill? But even before that, there is still opportunity to influence how we collect data, federal data that is. NASS, the National Agricultural Statistics Service, solicits, feedback on their surveys, on what types of data they collect. And SAC has been successful in, tweaking some of the surveys that go out. So I feel like this is an opportunity for you guys as folks who are, surveying and collecting data to say, hey, this is the type of data that we need to make better decisions on how things are working on the ground. So if you would like to, talk to NASS about how they collect their data, reach out to us and we can set up a meeting to get you connected with the folks who are developing those surveys. Same for research programs that fund this type of research. I'm sure many of you have grants to do this work. There are many others that, are doing the same, but do we have enough funding so that we are really getting enough data and studies out there to really evaluate what is happening. And all of this is prime opportunity for us for the next Farm Bill. So please keep in touch with Wes and I if you have further questions on how you can use this data or use the data that you are working on in your own project, how we can influence policymakers in the next Farm Bill. And we would love to have a discussion on that with you.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Thanks so much to the panelists for participating, and thank you for all the researchers for sharing your information and knowledge and expertise. As Don said, we'll post this recording by next week, and then we'll have summaries up there shortly. So thank you all again. Really appreciate it. Please join us for the next one next May 13th, Friday, about networks and how we can go further together if we think about linking up and connecting funders, evaluation, research, and our network.
Thank you, panelists. We appreciate you.